He fixed what the railroad left to die. Then the railroad wanted it back. Foster Cray had $12, a duffel bag with a set of mechanical tools he'd carried since his last steady job, and a habit of following abandoned rail grades to see where they actually ended rather than trusting the maps that called them simply discontinued. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten machinery that kept him fed for a few weeks at a stretch. He was 21 years old, laid off from a short-line railroad's maintenance crew 10 months earlier, when the company that owned the line sold its remaining assets to a larger carrier and eliminated every position that carrier's own regional crews could absorb instead. And he had been moving through rail towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The sale had come with a severance letter, thanking him for his years of dedicated service in the same paragraph that explained why the larger carrier's existing maintenance staff made his own position redundant, language Foster had read enough times since to understand, as the specific dialect companies used, when a person's actual usefulness mattered less than whichever crew already happened to be on somebody else's payroll. He had spent 10 months since then relearning, rail town by rail town, that his particular skill with diesel switchers and short-line track maintenance counted for a great deal less to most employers than whether he had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. He found the Millhaven spur outside the town of Deerfield Junction on a cool October afternoon. A mile and a half of rusted branch track, running from the main line to a lumber mill at its dead end, weeds grown thick between the ties. A small yard holding a single diesel switcher locomotive parked exactly where it had apparently been left. Its paint faded, its windows grimed with a decade of neglect. A faded sign at the spur's junction with the main line read, Millhaven Spur, Embargoed, Piedmont and Western Railroad, and beneath it, hand-lettered and newer, Property of Piedmont and Western, no trespassing. Foster stood at the switcher's cab a long while before he climbed up into it anyway. He had grown up the son of a short-line mechanic, riding along on maintenance calls from the age of 9, learning the particular mechanics of diesel switcher locomotives, the difference between an engine merely shut down and stored versus one actually damaged beyond reasonable repair. A distinction that had never once failed him, even after the sale that ended his own short-line career. Inside the switcher's engine compartment, the diesel prime mover sat coated in the specific dust of a machine that had simply been parked rather than actually broken, its major components intact beneath a decade of neglect. He walked the length of the yard slowly before touching anything further, the way his father had always insisted a man learn a locomotive before presuming to fix it. The wheels showed flat spots from sitting stationary too long, but no cracks in the axles themselves. The cab's controls sat exactly where a crew would have left them, throttle notched back, brake set, the particular orderliness of a machine that had been properly shut down rather than abandoned in a hurry. He did not have a plan yet beyond understanding what he was looking at. In 10 months on the road, he had learned that was usually plan enough to start with. He walked into Deerfield Junction itself the next morning looking for day work, and found, within his first hour at the town's diner, that the spur and its idle switcher carried more weight in local frustration than their embargoed signs suggested. That spur served Deerfield lumber for 60 years before Piedmont and Western embargoed it, said a broad-shouldered man behind the counter, his name tag reading Holt. Traffic dropped off during a bad decade for the mill, and the railroad decided it wasn't worth running anymore. Problem is, the mill's business came back considerably since then, and now every board foot of lumber that used to ship by rail goes out by truck instead, at nearly triple the cost, over roads that wash out every spring and close outright in a hard winter. Why doesn't the mill just truck it and be done complaining? Foster asked. Because triple the shipping cost eats into wages the mill can pay its own workers, Holt said. Half this town works at that mill one way or another. Piedmont and Western's embargo isn't costing them anything. It's costing us." Reba Aldrich, who managed the lumber mill's small office and had worked there for over 20 years, found Foster at the diner the following morning and sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. The particular directness of someone who had run out of patience for the railroad's excuses a long time ago. "Heard you've been poking around the switcher," Reba said. "You planning on doing anything with it, or just satisfying your own curiosity?" "I'm planning on understanding it first," Foster said, then deciding. "Understand it fast," Reba said. "We've got a state highway contract coming up this winter that needs more lumber moved than our trucks can reliably handle once the mountain roads start icing over. If that spur and that switcher could run again, even informally, it'd save this mill a season that otherwise might cost us contracts we can't afford to lose." The mockery, when it came mostly from two of the mill's younger truck drivers who took their coffee at the same diner counter each morning, one of whom made a point of asking, loud enough for Foster to hear across the room, whether the drifter playing railroad understood that Piedmont and Western would have him arrested the moment they noticed a stranger running their embargoed equipment. Foster said nothing to that, because he had learned over 10 months of exactly this kind of comment in exactly this kind of town, that defending yourself to men who had already decided what you were rarely changed anything except your own dignity. Reba started stopping by the yard most evenings after the mill's office closed, at first simply to gauge whether Foster's work was serious or merely another false hope in a decade full of them, and later, as the weeks passed, bringing him tools and parts from the mill's own maintenance shop that he needed and couldn't yet afford. "Wasn't using half of this anyway," she'd say, setting down a box of fittings or a spare filter, in a tone Foster was slowly learning meant considerably more than the words themselves let on. Foster spent his first full week at the yard doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He looked at what was actually broken and started fixing it. The switcher's main engine had seized where its bearings had dried out from disuse, and Foster worked penetrating oil into the housing over 3 careful days. The same patient process his father had taught him for any engine that had sat idle too long, until the crankshaft finally turned under his hand on the 4th morning, a low, grinding groan rolling across the whole silent yard. The fuel system needed a complete cleaning, decades-old diesel having gummed the injectors into uselessness, and Foster spent nearly a week disassembling and cleaning each component by hand, testing the spray pattern of every injector against an improvised rig before trusting any of them back into the engine. The track itself needed as much attention as the locomotive, the 1.5 miles of spur overgrown, and in 2 low sections, washed out where culverts had clogged and let runoff undermine the roadbed. Foster spent nearly 2 weeks clearing brush, repacking the washed sections with gravel he hauled by hand from a nearby creek bed, and resetting a dozen spikes that had worked loose from ties gone soft with rot, testing the rail's gauge with the borrowed measuring tool at every section before trusting a locomotive's weight to it. The main switch connecting the spur to the interchange track had rusted solid in its throw bar, a critical failure point that would have made the whole restoration meaningless if it couldn't be reliably operated. And Foster spent 3 additional days freeing the mechanism, replacing worn linkage pins with stock he found in the switcher's own crew cabinet, and testing the point's alignment repeatedly until the switch threw clean and true in both directions. The switcher's air brake system needed its own attention, valves and lines cleaned and tested separately from the engine work, because Foster's father had taught him early that an engine that ran was only half a working locomotive if the brakes couldn't be trusted to stop it reliably. By the time Foster finally ran the switcher through its first full test along the restored track, a small crowd had gathered at the mill's dock to watch, word having spread through Deerfield Junction the way it always did. Once people noticed the switcher's headlight burning at dusk for the first time in a decade. The engine's horn sounded once as it eased down the spur toward the interchange, and the small crowd let out something between a laugh and a cheer that caught Foster off guard, coming from people who'd mostly regarded him with polite suspicion only weeks before. Holt himself stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed, watching the switcher roll past with an expression that had softened considerably since his first skeptical remarks at the diner counter. It was in the switcher's small crew cabinet, tucked behind a stack of old inspection forms, that Foster found the logbook, its cover reading Millhaven Spur, Station Agent's Record, E. Whitlock, 1952-1981. He read it that same evening by lantern light, and understood, well before he'd finished the first section, exactly what Holt and Reba both seemed to think the railroad had gotten away with for over a decade. Elias Whitlock had served as the Spur's dispatcher and station agent for nearly 30 years, and his final entries, dated the year the embargo began, described the regulatory process in careful, specific detail. Railroad has embargoed service on this spur citing insufficient traffic, effective this month. I've reviewed the applicable regulations and understand that an embargo is meant to be temporary, pending either resumed service or formal abandonment filed with the State Transportation Authority. A common carrier cannot simply embargo a line indefinitely without either restoring service or properly abandoning its obligation. I've written the state authority directly to ask whether Piedmont and Western has filed the required abandonment paperwork. I have not yet received a reply. There was a middle entry, dated roughly a year after the embargo began, that Foster found himself returning to more than once in the weeks that followed. Mill's shipping costs have nearly tripled since the embargo, trucking every board foot over roads never built for that kind of continuous heavy hauling. Talked to 3 mill workers this week whose hours got cut because the added freight cost ate into the budget that used to pay them. I keep asking myself who exactly benefits from this embargo, since it plainly isn't the mill, isn't the town, and as far as I can tell, isn't even the railroad in any way beyond avoiding the modest paperwork of an honest abandonment. I've concluded the only real beneficiary is the convenience of nobody at Piedmont and Weston having to make an actual decision. There was a later entry, the final one in the logbook, that Foster read a second time before setting it aside for the night. No abandonment filing has been made, according to the state authorities' own records, 3 full years after the embargo began. Piedmont and Western holds this spur in a kind of regulatory limbo, neither serving it nor properly releasing their obligation to do so. I suspect they intend to simply let it rot indefinitely, rather than either resuming service or formally giving up their claim to the right-of-way, since holding the embargoed asset costs them nothing, while an active abandonment might invite scrutiny they'd rather avoid. I record this here in case anyone in the future needs to understand exactly how a railroad can leave a town stranded without ever technically breaking a single regulation. Foster closed the logbook and sat with it a long while, understanding that he was holding in his own 2 hands 30 years of a dispatcher's careful documentation, proving that Piedmont and Western's embargo had outlasted by decades whatever temporary justification it might once have had. The company man arrived at the yard on a gray Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks after Foster had begun his work, stepping out of a truck lettered Piedmont and Western Railroad with a folder of documents under one arm. "Name's Corbin Ashby," the man said. "Regional Asset Recovery for Piedmont and Western. I understand you've been running that switcher without authorization on an embargoed spur that remains our property." "I've restored the engine and the track," Foster said. "I've also found the original dispatcher's record showing this embargo's outlasted any formal justification by nearly 3 decades, without your company ever filing the abandonment paperwork the regulations require. I don't think that leaves this spur quite as simply yours as your folder probably claims." Ashby's expression carried the particular smoothness of a man who had prepared for a different conversation than the one he was actually having. "An embargo doesn't transfer ownership," he said. This equipment and this right-of-way remain Piedmont and Western property regardless of how long the embargoes lasted. I'll need the switcher returned to operational storage and this spur cleared of unauthorized activity. If the embargoes outlasted the legal period without a formal abandonment filing, that's not just a paperwork oversight, Foster said. That's a common carrier obligation your company's been quietly avoiding for 30 years, while this town's biggest employer paid triple the freight cost, trucking lumber over roads that wash out every spring. I'd think the State Transportation Authority might have some interest in that discrepancy if it came to their attention properly. I don't set embargo policy, Ashby said. I'm here to recover company assets, not to relitigate a decision made decades before I took this position. Then, perhaps the person who does set that policy ought to explain to the state authority why an embargo meant to be temporary lasted 30 years without either resuming service or properly releasing the obligation, Foster said. I'd rather have that conversation with someone who can actually answer it than continue this one with someone who can't. Ashby's composure faltered just slightly before he turned and drove off without further argument. Word reached Reba Aldrich by that same evening, and she came out to the yard with an expression that had lost none of the bluntness Foster had come to expect from her. Piedmont and Western's counting on nobody ever actually checking whether they filed that abandonment paperwork, Reba said. I intend to make sure the state does exactly that, and I expect the mill's owner will back me on it, given what this embargo's cost us every winter for a decade. Reba filed the formal request with the State Transportation Authority herself, attaching copies of Elias Whitlock's dispatcher records alongside the mill's own decade of shipping invoices, showing the added costs the embargo had forced onto the business every winter since. She brought the mill's owner along to a preliminary hearing, and Foster testified as well, describing the condition of the track and locomotive in plain mechanical detail, careful to stick to what he'd personally verified, rather than anything he merely suspected. The State Transportation Authority's review, requested formally by Reba on the mill's behalf and supported by Elias Whitlock's dispatcher records, confirmed within a month that Piedmont and Western had never filed the required abandonment application, leaving the spur legally subject to a forced sale or transfer to a willing short-line operator under state regulations governing indefinitely embargoed common carrier lines. The heavy snow arrived earlier than expected that winter, closing the mountain roads Deerfield Lumber's trucks depended on for nearly 2 weeks straight. At the exact moment the mill's state highway contract required a substantial shipment that no truck could safely move over ice-covered switchbacks. Foster had spent the weeks leading up to it running the switcher through short test hauls each afternoon, building confidence in the restored brakes and engine under load, some instinct telling him the season's first real storm would ask more of the line than any controlled test could arrange on his own schedule. It was Reba who reached Foster first. Roads are closed for at least a week, maybe 2, she said, her breath fogging an air that had dropped well below what the season usually brought this early. We lose this contract if we can't move product, and losing this contract costs us business we won't get back easily. If that switcher can run a real load, now's the time to prove it. The engine's held steady on every test I've run for a month, Foster said, already moving to check every connection one final time under the pressure of the moment. I can move it. I'll need help loading at the mill's dock, but the locomotive itself is ready. Foster ran the switcher on a real working schedule for the first time in over a decade, hauling loaded lumber cars the 1.5 miles from the mill's dock to the main line interchange, where a Piedmont and Western freight, ironically, still picked up the traffic under standard interline agreements. The embargo had never actually terminated. On the 3rd day of the emergency schedule, the fuel line Foster had cleaned weeks earlier developed a slow leak at a fitting he hadn't fully torqued, and he spent a tense hour working beneath the locomotive in the cold, with cars still queued for loading, breath freezing in the air above him, before the leak sealed properly and the schedule resumed. Corbin Ashby arrived at the yard himself during the second week of the emergency schedule. Having heard, the way everyone eventually heard everything in a region this size, that the spur his company had tried to reclaim was now moving freight. His own railroad was still collecting revenue from at the interchange. "That's Piedmont and Western equipment moving that traffic," Ashby said, watching a loaded car roll toward the main line. "It's equipment your company embargoed and never properly abandoned, moving freight your own railroad is still billing for at the interchange," Foster said. "I'd think that arrangement benefits Piedmont and Western considerably more than it costs them, whatever your asset recovery folder says about unauthorized activity." Ashby watched the loaded car complete its coupling at the interchange, his expression unreadable for a long moment. "I've recovered a great deal of equipment for this company over the years," he said finally. "Storage yards, sidings, old depot buildings nobody's used in decades. I don't think I've ever once had to explain to a state authority why our own revenue department was quietly benefiting from an asset we were simultaneously trying to reclaim as abandoned." "Then perhaps this is the file where that explanation finally gets written down," Foster said. Ashby didn't have an answer for that. He watched the loaded car roll past, said nothing further, and left. And Reba told Foster afterward that she doubted Piedmont and Western would be pressing the matter much further once their own revenue department noticed the interchange traffic Ashby's division had been trying to shut down. By spring, the state authorities' forced transfer process concluded, and the Millhaven spur, along with the switcher locomotive, passed formally to a newly chartered short-line operation backed by the mill and the town, with Foster named as the line's chief mechanic and engineer, a position that came with a modest salary, and, more importantly to Foster, a legal claim to work he'd already spent a hard winter proving he could do properly. Corbin Ashby's Asset Recovery Division did not contest the transfer once Piedmont and Western's own revenue records confirmed how much the company had already collected at the interchange from traffic its own embargo had supposedly prohibited, an inconsistency that made further argument considerably harder to justify to anyone reviewing the file. Reba mentioned, some months later, that Ashby himself had moved to a different division within the company, and she seemed to take a certain satisfaction in the idea that his asset recovery folder had cost him at least as much as it had ever threatened to cost Foster. Foster wrote to his own father that spring, describing the restored switcher and the newly chartered short line in more detail than the man probably needed, but would certainly enjoy. A diesel switcher, finally given somewhere real to run after 10 months of Foster, wondering whether his own particular skills still had a place anywhere. His father's reply came a few weeks later, characteristically brief. "Told you a well-maintained switcher could outlast any company's decision that a line wasn't worth running anymore. Proud of you for seeing it through properly, instead of just walking past it like every other stranger must have for 10 years. Sounds like you found your way back to the family trade after all. Same as your grandfather always hoped one of us would." Foster kept Elias Whitlock's logbook in the same crew cabinet where he'd found it, and added a second logbook of his own beside it. On its first page, he wrote the only sentence that felt honest enough to begin with. This spur was left to die not through any real failure, but through a company deciding indefinite neglect cost less than an honest abandonment. Elias Whitlock wrote down exactly how long that neglect lasted, decades in advance, so somebody could finally hold the company to the difference. I intend to keep this line running honestly, the way he always meant it to be run. Reba Aldrich stopped by the yard most weeks after that, not always with news, sometimes only to watch the switcher work another cut of cars toward the interchange. The particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent a decade watching her mill absorb costs. It never should have had to carry and had finally been allowed to stop absorbing them. The mill's owner formally credited the restored spur with saving the state highway contract that winter, and the wage cuts that had followed the embargo's early years were quietly reversed the following spring, a connection Reba made a point of explaining to anyone in town who asked why the mill suddenly seemed to be doing better than it had in years. The two truck drivers who'd once mocked Foster at the diner counter became, in the months that followed, two of the short line's most regular customers for personal hauling jobs, moving firewood and equipment along the 1.5 of restored track, rather than fighting the mountain roads for short trips that no longer required it. Neither of them ever apologized outright for their earlier comments, but both took to nodding at Foster each morning with something that had, over time, become close enough to genuine respect that Foster stopped thinking much about the earlier mockery at all. Foster thought, some evenings, about his own short-line career, ended by a sale that had valued consolidation over the actual towns a smaller railroad had once served, and understood that Elias Whitlock's careful documentation of Piedmont and Weston's quiet neglect was the same story, written decades earlier, that had eventually cost Foster his own livelihood on a different line entirely. He had found, in an embargoed spur at the edge of a lumber town, exactly the kind of work his own family had always believed mattered, running now on terms a company could no longer simply neglect into non-existence whenever it stopped being convenient. He rang the switcher's bell once at the start of every morning run after that, a habit that served no real operational purpose but felt, to Foster, like the smallest possible way of telling the whole valley that the line was open, running, and no longer subject to being quietly forgotten by whoever happened to hold the paper on it. Deerfield Junction kept its long memory of the embargo years the way small towns always do, and what it remembered now, when it told the story of the Millhaven Spur, was not the decade the railroad had let it rot, but the winter a stranger with $12 had proven that neglect and abandonment were never quite the same thing, whatever a company's paperwork tried to pretend. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many public obligations get quietly left in limbo, neither honored nor properly released, simply because indefinite neglect costs a company less than an honest decision either way? And what does it take, a hard winter, a stranger, a dispatcher's careful record, for that neglect to finally be called exactly what it is? If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Salvage Line for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.